mode.
Good morning, everyone. It's just at 10 o'clock right now. It's Tom Bellis from Concrete Ontario. We're just waiting for about a handful more participants, and we'll get started in about another minute or two. So please stay on the line, and we'll get going at about 10:02, 10:03. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. In respect of everyone's time, we're going to get going. We still have a handful of people yet to dial in. But regardless, we said we would start at 10 a.m. and it's just after 10, so we'll get going. As I said, it's Tom Bellis from Concrete Ontario. Today's webinar is going to be approximately an hour. We have about a 5-minute introduction, and then our guest speaker, John O'Grady, will be talking about for 35 to 40 minutes, let's say, and then we'll open it up for conversation for questions. So for those of you that haven't been on the webinar before, we read our Welcome and Competition Act statement. I'll advise of the webinar protocol, how it's set up. Quick presenter introduction for John O'Grady. He'll go over the 2017 economic outlook. Then we'll open up the floor for questions, and then there are a few Concrete Ontario announcements at the end of the presentation. So, as participants in this meeting, we must be mindful of the constraints of the Competition Act. There shall be no discussion of agreements or actions that may restrain competition. This prohibition includes the exchange of information concerning individual company prices, costs, margins, sales and operating plans, rates, market practices, claims settlement practices, or any other competitive aspect of a company's operation. Each participant is obligated to speak up immediately for the purpose of preventing any discussion falling outside these bounds. A little bit about the webinar protocol. All lines are automatically muted when you dial in. If you do have a question during the call, you can use the question dialog box that's in your GoToWebinar control panel. Just type in your question there, or alternatively, either after the presentation or if you want to ask something offline, you can send me an email directly, tbellis@concreteontario.org, and we'll follow up with an answer after the webinar. John O'Grady is a partner at Prism Economics and Analysis. Prior to launching a full-time consulting career in 1990, he worked for the Ontario Federation of Labour, the Canadian Labour Congress, the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions, Ontario Public Service Employees Union, and the Economic Council of Canada. Mr. O'Grady has prepared wage arbitration submissions for several construction unions and has also represented a number of police associations in wage disputes. During social contract negotiations, Mr. O'Grady was an advisor to the Ontario Association of Physicians and Dentists in Public Service. He has taught industrial relations courses at 2 Ontario universities and is the author of several published articles on industrial relations and human resource management issues. Mr. O'Grady has served as an executive member for various research and social organizations, such as the North-South Institute, the Institute for Work and Health, and Ortec Corporation. At this time, I'm just for everyone on the line, John is connecting with us remotely from his office. So I will just pass him over the reins. So if you bear with us for one moment. Hi, John, are you there?
Yes, indeed.
Thank you.
And my presentation is on the screen?
Yes, it is.
Excellent. Okie doke. Well, let's begin. Good morning. What I'm going to do this morning is provide an overview of the economic outlook for 2017 with emphasis on the construction industry and in particular on the more concrete intensive side of the construction industry, but also look at some of the risks to that outlook because I think the risks are increasingly important. So the topics that I'm just going to go through and touch on will be interest rates, the price of oil, some comments on infrastructure, the general shift in government policy from monetary policy to fiscal policy, the risk of asset bubbles, the Paris Agreement, or more specifically cap and trade here in Ontario, and then the implications of the new administration that will be sworn in, I guess, next week or the week after in the United States. So let me start with interest rates. Interest rates are one of the most important factors affecting the outlook for the construction industry, and keeping in mind the nature of the markets for ready-mix. It's useful, I think, to distinguish between the ICI sector and the impact of the interest rate on construction there and new residential construction, or more particularly the condo sector. In the case of the ICI sector, the impact of the interest rate is exceptionally powerful. Indeed, it is probably the single most important economic variable shaping the outlook for construction spending in the ICI sector. On this particular slide, on the left-hand side, you see a graph that tracks ICI construction spending, that's the red line, and the 10-year bond rate, that's the blue line over the last roughly 20 years. And you can see that the relationship is virtually inverse. A decline in the 10-year bond rate corresponds to an increase in ICI construction spending. If you look at the graph on the right-hand side, the relationship between new residential construction and the mortgage rate is clearly present, but it's not nearly as marked as the relationship that we saw in the ICI sector. There are so many other factors that shape the demand for new residential construction, in particular demographics, employment trends, and unquestionably speculative behavior. people who are buying housing units now because they're afraid the price is going to go up in the future and they have to move now. The interest rate that gets the most attention, though it's not necessarily the most important one from the point of view of construction, is the bank rate, which is the rate that's set administratively by the Bank of Canada, which essentially is the rate that the Bank of Canada charges for overnight loans to the chartered banks. That bank rate is then feeds into other interest rates, notably the prime rate. There's a very strong relationship between the prime rate, which would affect business operating loans, receivable financing, leasing costs, and the Bank of Canada rate. There is a strong relationship, though not quite as strong, with the mortgage rate, and similarly with consumer credit consumer credit rates, chiefly for credit cards and autos. For the construction industry, the ICI segment of the construction industry in particular, the most important interest rate is the long-term bond rate, because construction financing is usually a long-term exercise, and the relationship between the bank rate and the long-term bond rate tends to be fairly weak. If we do see a movement in the bank rate over the course of this year, and I suspect that's unlikely, but if we do see one, its impact will be moderately felt in the residential sector through its impact on mortgage rates, but it will not have, in all likelihood, a significant effect on the long-term bond rate and on the outlook for ICI construction. The consensus among most of the economists with the chartered banks is that the bank rate will be essentially stable through 2017, and that's notwithstanding the expectation that the Federal Reserve of the United States will increase its interest rates over the course of the year, as it has announced its intention to do so. The long-term bond rate, which is the one that's so important for non-residential construction, is expected to increase by about 0.5%, maybe 0.75% over 2017, and that's not enough to really have any significant negative effect on the outlook for ICI construction. The second topic I want to say a few words about is oil and commodity prices, or chiefly oil prices. The price of oil has come back somewhat over the course of this year. The other day when I checked, it was the price of a barrel of oil for West Texas Intermediate, which is the benchmark, was US $51.50. The forecasts for 2017 essentially are for a fairly stable outlook for the price of oil, and you can see there that there's 5 forecasting organizations: the U.S. Energy Information Agency, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, the OECD, and the Economist Intelligence Unit, and they're all relatively within the $49 to $56 range. What we've seen in the last couple of weeks is that, coincident with the increase in the price of oil, there's been an increase in inventories that are being built up in the United States, and so that means it's an inventory-based demand, not a user-based demand. So there's no real expectation that the price of oil is going to break out of its current trading range right now, which is on the low side $45, on the high side $55, $56. The implication of that outlook is that the major oil sand investments will by and large remain on hold. Some of the lower cost producers will get back into expanding capacity or carrying out deferred investments or deferred maintenance operations that they had put on hold in the past couple of years. But in the main, the major investment projects that were on the books will stay on the books. They will not be carried out at this price level. The Canadian dollar will remain weak. It'll remain under 80 cents. We'll see continued high unemployment in the three provinces that are so heavily dependent on fossil fuels: Alberta, Saskatchewan, Newfoundland. Importantly, there will be no pressure on the Bank of Canada to raise the bank rate, and therefore no pressure on the Bank of Canada or no pressure on subsequent pressure on mortgage rates. And from a labor market point of view, construction workers in Atlantic Canada who had been looking to Western Canada for employment will once again, as they have traditionally in the past, look to Ontario for employment. So you're not going to see any kind of labor market shortages over the course of the next year or so, constraining construction activity in Ontario, or more specifically in the GTA. Infrastructure. Infrastructure is certainly the big economic story for the next few years. Governments at all levels are increasing their infrastructure spending. One of the initiatives that did not get as much comment as one might have expected from the federal government initiative is the planned federal infrastructure bank. This was announced in the last budget. We will probably see it implemented over the course of this year. What the proposed infrastructure bank will do is enable provinces and municipalities to access borrowed funds for infrastructure at the federal government's cost of borrowing, which of course is the lowest borrowing rate in the country. For the province of Ontario, that doesn't mean a great deal because the province of Ontario's borrowing rate is very similar, almost the same, marginally higher than the federal government's, but it will mean something for municipalities, which typically do have a higher borrowing rate than the federal government. So for the GTA municipalities, for $100 million of borrowed funds, there would be an annual savings to them of around $1.4 million per year in interest rate costs. Not a huge impact, but enough to make a difference in terms of the timing and the magnitude of municipally sponsored infrastructure projects. The federal infrastructure bank will also take an equity stake in infrastructure projects, but that's limited to those types of projects that are potentially generate a net income stream. And there, I think the message is that we're likely to see more toll roads coming in the future. The outlook for infrastructure spending remains very strong, roughly $13 billion per year. We also are going to see the Darlington refurb commenced. It's already commenced in October, and the Bruce refurb is going to commence in 2020. The government may even bring that forward. The federal government has announced an additional almost $12 billion in its March budget, and a further $81 billion over 10 years in its more recent November economic statement. So there's been a fairly substantial increase in the financial resources that are being deployed in infrastructure construction. Infrastructure spending is going to offset some of the tapering off that we are likely to see in residential construction. For this particular sector, one of the caveats that you have to make note of is that infrastructure, it's not only less labor intensive, but many types of infrastructure are also less concrete intensive than building construction. The next topic I want to comment on is the policy rotation, as it's called, which is the shift from monetary policy, quantitative easing, low interest rates, to fiscal policy. Monetary stimulus has taken three forms. The first, as we know, is low bank rate. That's the rate that is charged by the central banks, and indeed in In Europe and Japan, low bank rates mean negative interest rates. A downward manipulation of the long-term bond rate, which has not been undertaken in Canada but was undertaken in the United States by the Federal Reserve, and then straight-out monetary expansion. The impact of monetary stimulus has been waning. It's, I think, widely recognized now that further increases in monetary stimulus are likely to have a diminishing impact on the economy. And so you've seen over the last year a shift in terms of the recommendations that international bodies like the IMF and the OECD have been making to governments to shift from monetary policy to fiscal policy or infrastructure spending to move their economies into a higher growth trajectory. In the United States, and the policy agenda there is still being formulated and finalized. Most likely, from what we have been seeing in the media over the last few weeks, there will be a package of corporate tax cuts, possibly also personal tax cuts, and an increase in defense spending. There may or may not be an increase in infrastructure spending in the United States. The Trump administration has indicated that it wants to do something on infrastructure spending, and the House Republicans have been less enthusiastic about that part of the Trump economic program. In Canada, the commitment to infrastructure pretty much at all levels of government remains very strong. And as we know from a few days ago, the federal government will be moving its own fiscal position into deficit for a number of years to come. Some of the negatives on the economic horizon relate to asset price bubbles. A run-up in the price of assets that is arguably out of line with economic realities. And the two assets that we see that behavior in are, first of all, in the equity markets, where the price of equities is at historic highs in relation to earnings, and also see it in the real estate market in a number of regions, most notably here in the GTA, where there's been quite a dramatic run-up in housing and condo prices. Whether equity markets are seriously overpriced, and certainly in terms of their long-term average, they appear seriously overpriced. That will largely be determined by the earnings reports that we see coming out over the course of the next 3 and 6 months. If earnings increase substantially, then that will justify the higher equity prices that we've seen in the market. If, as is more likely, earnings growth will be very moderate, sometimes flat, then those equity prices will look pretty high. A lot of the yields that we see right now in dividend-bearing equities are essentially being propped up by leverage, meaning high levels of borrowing. In the GTA, house prices have doubled if we look back over about 10 years, and half of that increase, half of that doubling, occurred in the last 2 years. That kind of growth in prices is quite obviously unsustainable. With mortgage rates likely to remain low through 2017, the main levers that we're going to see in order to dampen down demand will be the impact of the higher down payment ratios that were announced, and the reductions in mortgage insurance that were announced also last year. We may or may not see taxes imposed on foreign buyers, as was done in British Columbia. Asset bubbles pose a very serious problem because if they are burst, they put enormous pressure on the financial system, which of course we saw back in 2008. And I am reminded of a speech that Queen Elizabeth gave to the London School of Economics just after the 2008 financial crisis, in which she paused, took off her glasses, and said, "Why did nobody notice it coming?" Let me now turn to the Paris Agreement, or more broadly to the issue of carbon pricing. The graph that you see on your screen right now is from the Federal Department of Energy and Climate Change. And what it does is it shows the projected emissions of greenhouse gases through to 2030 under a couple of scenarios. And also, a little lower down on the graph there, you can see where the Canadian 2020 target is and where the Canadian 2030 target is. And quite clearly, in order to move that growth trajectory anywhere close to those targets will require fairly significant changes in policy. And of course, those changes in policy generally tend to focus on imposing a price on carbon. Ontario has introduced its climate change action policy. There are a number of features to that policy. Certainly, one of the most central ones is the cap and trade system, which was introduced effective January 1st of this year. Ontario is intending to get greenhouse gas emissions down by 15% compared to the 1990 level in 2020, by 37% in 2030, and by 80% in 2050. One of the implications of the particular cap and trade system that Ontario has introduced is, first of all, that it puts domestic production at a disadvantage compared to imports, and so that may have some implications for the cement industry, in that the domestic cement industry here in Ontario will be subject to cap and trade, but imported cement will not be, unless there is some kind of an arrangement that is entered into with the federal government to impose requirements at the border. A province cannot impose requirements at the border. Secondly, the implications for the choice between concrete and structural steel. In round terms, the carbon pricing for structural steel and for concrete, or for cement rather, should be virtually, pretty much the same. In other words, the impact on one should be not terribly different from the impact on the other. So while costs of both products go up, their relative position should not be affected. That, however, is not going to be the case. The provincial government has involvements with the steel industry. As you know, it's going through a restructuring right now. The province has an indirect financial involvement in the industry, basically through its obligations under the Pension Benefits Guarantee Fund for the former employees of steel companies. And as a result of that, the province has essentially indicated to the steel industry that it will probably get waivers on the application of cap and trade, and so in relative terms, concrete will be at a greater disadvantage than structural steel. And there's a class of buildings, as you're well aware, where from an engineering point of view, structural steel and poured in place concrete are equally effective engineering solutions, and it comes down chiefly to cost, to some degree to architectural specification, but mostly to cost in terms of which material is chosen. The LEED system for crediting buildings, and LEED has become increasingly important. Frankly, I don't think it's possible now to build a public sector building that doesn't have LEED certification, and many of the larger, more publicly prominent private sector buildings are now seeking LEED certification. Quite frankly, LEED is unsupportive of concrete. If there's an implied bias in the LEED system, it's a bias to structural steel. So those are issues on the horizon that potentially have some competitive implications for the concrete industry. The last topic I want to turn to, and in many ways it's from the point of view of the economic outlook, it's potentially the most serious for Canada, and I think awareness of that has been growing over the last couple of weeks. And that's where the United States is going to be going on some of its economic policies as those policies might affect Canada. First off is NAFTA. There appears to be no question that NAFTA is going to be renegotiated. Unquestionably, the U.S. is going to press for changes in country of origin rules and in softwood lumber rules. That's not likely to have a big impact on Ontario. But there are other areas where the U.S. may be seeking changes which potentially would have an impact on Ontario. You could see the United States seeking an agreement on exchange rates. You could see them seeking an agreement on the financing of social programs. The argument there would be to force Medicare to be partially or wholly financed by payroll taxes so as to make it analogous to the way in which healthcare is funded in the United States. We have heard House Republicans objecting to the fact that Canada waives HST on exports. I'm sure any subsidies to the aerospace industry, specifically Bombardier, will be on the agenda. And the subsidy program that we have for the film industry to create Hollywood North will certainly be on the agenda. The more significant changes, I think, are actually the ones that are have been getting attention in the last, actually really just beginning this week. And those are the proposed tax changes that, while they were associated with Donald Trump, in fact, the origin of these proposed tax changes is the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan. And that's what they're calling the Border Adjustment Tax. It's a little complicated, so just bear with me, but the implications of this can be very serious. What is proposed is that in the United States is that the corporate tax system be significantly restructured so that companies that are exporting would not have the revenues derived from exports included in their taxable income. And secondly, the expenditures that they make on imports would not be deductible from taxable income. So essentially what the so-called border adjustment tax would do is use the tax system to implement tariffs that the United States has committed itself not to implement under both the World Trade Organization and its various trade agreements, such as NAFTA. If the United States goes forward with this border adjustment tax, it could have potentially devastating impacts on those countries that are most reliant on their exports to the United States. And those countries are respectively Mexico and Canada. Both of those, all of those changes to the American tax system would contravene the World Trade Organization, which requires that corporate taxes be neutral with respect to their treatment of imports and exports. And that therefore would also mean that if the United States goes forward with this kind of border adjustment tax, it will essentially be tossing the WTO agreements out the door as well. You may have seen in the last couple of days the Howe Research Institute has sounded the alarm bells on the potential implications for Canada of this border adjustment tax. The United States, or at least the Trump administration, has indicated that the United States should withdraw from the Paris Agreement. That may or may not ultimately happen. Tillerson, in his confirmation hearings yesterday, indicated that he thought the United States should not withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Whatever transpires, American policy is going to make Ontario's cap and trade program difficult to sustain, and we may see some discussion about a shift from that program to a carbon tax as operates in BC and Alberta. There may also be some pressure, competitive pressure, on the federal government to scale back on its target of a $50 per ton price for carbon. Another area of potential concern is a tightening of border security. The outgoing ambassador to the United States, Heyman, had negotiated administrative agreements with Canada that expedited the flow of goods, and to some extent people, across the border. Any actions which impede the flow of goods across the border have a very profound effect on our auto parts industry, which basically ships on a just-in-time delivery scheduling basis. And so if those goods don't make it to an American, to a U.S.-based assembly plant in time, then that jeopardizes the supply chain. If there is an infrastructure component to the new set of policy in the United States, that infrastructure spending will undoubtedly have a Buy America program in it, and as in the past, that has excluded Canadian suppliers from bidding on U.S. infrastructure projects. U.S. defense spending will certainly increase. That will probably put some pressure on Canada to increase its defense spending, and the most obvious place to reallocate money to defense is unfortunately from the infrastructure budget. So we may see pressure for a reallocation there. Lastly, of course, Keystone is likely to be approved. If Keystone is built, and I'm not sure whether the economic case, the financial case for Keystone is as compelling today as it used to be. But if Keystone is built, it's very doubtful that additional pipeline capacity will be needed unless the price of oil gets somewhere above $80. And that really means that much of the debate around Trans Mountain and Energy East is redundant. So the construction outlook. Well, for Ontario overall, and these forecasts come from BuildForce, which is now the most widely used set of forecasts for the construction industry. The general outlook for the construction industry in Ontario is that in real terms, it's projected to increase by about 3.8% in 2017. Then to flatten in 2018, but not decline, and increase fairly marginally in 2019, 2020. So broadly speaking, it's a what you see is what you get outlook for the construction industry overall. If we drill down to look at the Greater Toronto area, the outlook for 2017 construction is marginally stronger, an increase of 4.1%. Again, it would then be projected to flatten in 2018, and you may or may not see some decline in 2019, 2020, but a very similar outlook for the GTA. And as you can see from that graph, the majority of that construction is in the residential sector. For concrete forming, the projections are broadly similar. Concrete forming work is projected to increase by about 1.8% in the GTA in 2017. Thereafter, it will level off or decline marginally. The Ontario outlook is broadly the same as the GTA outlook. The risk to that forecast would be any significant downturn in the high-rise residential construction sector. If we look at the medium-term outlook for a year or two, looking at building permits in the condo sector for the GTA, what we can see here is that there's been a fairly significant decline in the last year or two in building permits that developers have taken out for the construction of condos or high-rise apartments. So compared to a couple of years ago, compared to about a year and a bit ago, there's a decline of about 20%, 21% in building permit activity. This is not going to show up in 2017, but it will show up in less work in 2018 and 2019 in the condo sector. If we look at the cement producers, the producers, and these are Canadian data. We don't have data just for Ontario. Capacity utilization in the producers is running a little less than 80%. In general, the rule of thumb is that capacity utilization has to reach about 80% before an industry achieves pricing power. So the outlook for cement prices is essentially stable, though there would undoubtedly be some cost pass-through as a result of higher electricity prices and cap and trade. If we look at the price of rebar, which is certainly important to your customers, rebar prices are currently pretty much at their decennial average. Canadian scrap prices are a little bit higher than they were a year ago. Scrap is the main input into the manufacture of rebar. So for 2017, we'd expect probably a moderate price in the increase of rebar, and therefore that has some implications for the overall cost of poured-in-place concrete. If we look at the cost comparisons of in relative terms between ready-mix and structural steel, what we can see is that over the last couple of years, the price of structural steel, that's the price ex factory, has risen relative to the price of ready-mix, so that the competitiveness of ready-mix has improved in comparison with structural steel, although I think a good portion of that is likely to be offset by the differential treatment under cap and trade. So let me sum up. In the short term, the work that is underway or that's in the pipeline here in the GTA and in Ontario will support a moderate increase in the construction industry in 2017. And 2018 and 2019 we'll probably see the level of activity flatten off, but not likely to decline. For the cast and place industry, the outlook is very similar, except that the increase will be smaller in 2017. We may see some decline in 2018. That would mostly reflect in the GTA drop off in condo starts. Over the longer term, we've seen a relative increase in the price of structural steel. we're seeing the competitive advantage of that is somewhat offset by the increase in rebar prices that will affect your customers. More importantly, the differential treatment under cap and trade will probably offset a good portion of that change in relative prices that has otherwise been to your advantage. Infrastructure spending is going to replace some of the ICI and condo construction spending that we've seen. Infrastructure spending is generally less labor intensive, and depending on its nature, it is often less concrete intensive than building construction. In the longer term, the things I think to pay most attention to are the impact of policy that is related to the environment, and that's policies related to carbon pricing, whether it's carbon tax or cap and trade. The LEED system is going to become ever more prominent, and the bias that is implicit in that system against concrete is going to be a more significant competitive factor in the future. The major risks to what is otherwise a comparatively positive outlook are the asset inflation that we're seeing in equity markets and property markets, and if that asset inflation turns out to be a bubble and it bursts, then there are problems on the horizon. But the major risk to the outlook is certainly in relation to U.S. trade policy and the uncertainty that creates for investors in Canada. Many investors will simply hold off making decisions until the situation with respect to U.S. trade policy is clearer. And so that completes the presentation. Tom, over to you.
Thank you very much, John. I'm just going to take over the controls for you for a second. And as I mentioned, we will be opening up the floor for any questions that you may have. And again, what you would need to do is use the question dialog box panel in your GoToWebinar control panel. Or alternatively, as I mentioned, if there's something that wasn't covered in the presentation and you would like to take it offline, you can email me directly. It's tbellis, B-E-L-L-I-S, @concreteontario.org. And we can forward those questions to John to be answered. There was a general question about a copy of the presentation. Yes, it will be available online. That's part of the announcements that we have coming up, and I'll go through that shortly. I will give it a minute or so just to let anyone type any questions, and then we will move on to some of the association announcements that we have. So based on my control panel, I spoke too soon. I guess this question's directed towards the association itself in response to government's treatment of an unfair carbon tax bias. We'll take that offline and respond to the asker after the presentation because I honestly don't have that information at hand. So if there's anyone else that has a question, please feel free to write it. While attendees may be writing their questions, I'll just go through some of the announcements that are coming through our office. In relation to the first question about the webinar, yes, all webinars, including this one, are on our website on concreteontario.org. We have had some changes to our website. So the new location of our web recordings are under rmco.org/publications/webinar presentations. This webinar with the PDF documents will be loaded in about a day or two, definitely before the end of the week itself. Secondly, there is a question that has come in, but I will just go through the announcements. Again, just to mention to our membership, we do have a new sponsorship package available. It is on our website. We have done some restructuring on the website, but we do offer a corporate sponsorship package that can be found under our membership tab, as well as we have exclusive event sponsorship opportunities that's under the membership tab as well. If you do have any questions or concerns about the corporate sponsorship, you can contact our office and talk to our president, Chris Conway, or alternatively for the event sponsorship, our new events manager, Sylvia Benavides, is available to answer those questions. All the items online are a online form and payment gateway, so you can do everything directly on the website itself. Back to the question, we do have one question that has come in. If you just give me a second to read it, and I'll see if it's viable for the audience or something that we should take offline. The gist of the question, John, is could you, if you do have the information, to explain in more detail how steel is treated preferentially when it comes to, I believe, the cap and trade agreement?
Okay. Under the current rules, if they were simply applied as written, then based on carbon emissions, for which there's an accounting exercise that companies went through early last year, they have to purchase certain permits per ton of carbon emitted. That would be true of the steel industry. That would be true of the cement industry. In round terms, it takes about a ton of carbon to produce a ton of cement. I think it's probably 0.8 of a ton of carbon or something like that to produce a ton of cement, and it takes about a ton of carbon to produce a ton of steel. So on a straight output per ton basis, you would expect both industries to be in the market to purchase the required permits. The steel industry, because it's very export oriented, it's integrated into the NAFTA steel region, has essentially been given a waiver on at least that part of its production that will be exported, and it appears as if they are effectively going to be given leniency or waiver going into the future on a good portion of their production, which has a domestic orientation. So they're being treated with kit gloves for sure with respect to the application of the cap and trade program, whereas I'm not aware of any similar special treatment or favorable treatment that is being considered for the cement industry.
Thank you, John. I appreciate that. Just a follow-up question to the response. What is the driver for that decision, if you know?
Probably capital P politics. The steel industry tends to be concentrated, which means that its political effects are concentrated. The Hamilton area, the Niagara Peninsula area, Sault Ste. Marie being the most important centers in Ontario. So the impacts of a steel mill closure are felt intensely by those local communities, both in terms of employment as well as in terms of the the tax revenues and everything that support local government. So I think the politics are front and center. The second has been the fact that the Ontario government has had a history of being involved in trying to restructure the steel industry. This is simply another chapter in a very long book on the steel industry in Ontario. And the third is the one I alluded to. The retired workers of the in the steel industry. So take, for example, U.S. Steel in Hamilton, which owns the assets of the former Stelco. Technically, the Canadian operation of U.S. Steel is in bankruptcy. In fact, it's specifically it's under CCAA court supervised protection right now. One of the claimants are the retirees whose pension benefits and certain other benefits, notably medical benefits, were being supported by the then operating U.S. Steel concern. The pension benefits are guaranteed by what is called the Pension Benefits Guarantee Fund, which is a fund that was set up by the provincial government. The Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund is actually financed by premiums that are levied on all other pension funds, but it is ultimately backstopped by the province of Ontario. So the province of Ontario, in a sense, is on the hook in the Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund in two senses. First, it's the ultimate guarantor of that fund. But secondly, most of the remaining large defined benefit plans are in the public sector. So if the premiums to support the Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund go up, that basically means that the cost of public sector pension plans goes up, and that's the government of Ontario and other public sector entities in Ontario. So the government is either directly or indirectly also has a financial interest in the way in which the steel industry gets restructured, and the ability of that restructured industry to carry on with the liabilities that relate to retired employees, so that those liabilities don't get shifted either onto the province or onto the Pension Benefit Guarantee Fund.
Thank you. There is one final question that came in, and I will make it the final question as we are coming up to the top of the hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. But quickly, John, a question came in saying that they had seen that the Bank of America oil forecast would be at $70 per barrel in 2017, and if it does have a higher, the price of per barrel does have a higher price, what would be the significant impacts of that?
Oh well, that's certainly, it's an outlier forecast, but if it were to be an accurate forecast, if that's what happens, if a price at that level proves to be sustainable, and major companies will hold off to see if that price is sustainable. But if it proves sustainable, then there will be a lot of oil sands projects that will come back on stream. Some of the pipeline capacity issues will become more relevant than they were in the past, and the Canadian dollar will probably go up to about 90 cents.
Excellent. Thank you for the quick response. At this time, John, I'd like to thank you very much for being a presenter today. I'd also like to thank all our attendees for attending and staying with us for the full hour. As I mentioned, the presentation in the next day or so will be posted on our website under our publications menu item, which has moved from our membership item. So please look for it there. And again, if you do have any follow-up questions for the association or John specifically, you can email me directly, tbellis, B-E-L-L-I-S, at concreteontario.org. And again, thank you all for attending, and John, thank you for presenting.